In the summer of 2008, a woman in Orlando, Florida called 911 and said something that investigators would never forget. Her granddaughter had been missing for a month. And the car her daughter had been driving smelled like there had been a dead body inside it. At first, the dispatcher seemed confused. A month? How does a 2-year-old disappear for 31 days before anyone calls the police? But what made the situation even stranger was the mother. Because while little Caylee Anthony had supposedly vanished without a trace, her mother, Casey Anthony, had been going to clubs, entering hot body contests, spending nights with friends, and telling everyone around her that nothing was wrong. By the time investigators sat Casey down for questioning, they believed they were dealing with a missing child case. What they didn't realize yet was that almost everything Casey Anthony was telling them was a lie. And hidden somewhere inside those lies was one detail that would slowly begin collapsing her entire story. July 15, 2008. Orlando, Florida. The air outside the Anthony family home felt heavy that afternoon. Inside, tensions had already reached a breaking point. Casey Anthony had just arrived back at the house after being gone for days. Her mother, Cindy Anthony, immediately noticed something was wrong. Not just with Casey. With the car. The silver Pontiac smelled horrific. Later, multiple people would describe the odor differently. Some said it smelled like garbage left in unbearable heat. Others said something darker. Something biological. Something they couldn't forget. But that wasn't even the reason Cindy finally called police. The real panic started when she realized she hadn't seen her granddaughter Caylee in over a month. 31 days. That number would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. Because according to Casey, there was an explanation. There always seemed to be an explanation. Caylee, she said, had been staying with a nanny named Zenaida Gonzalez. Casey claimed the nanny suddenly disappeared with the child. But when Cindy pressed harder, the story became unclear. Where was the nanny now? Why hadn't Casey reported this earlier? Why did every answer seem incomplete? And why did Casey appear strangely calm? The 911 call itself sounded chaotic. Cindy Anthony's voice shifted between anger and panic. At one point she handed the phone to Casey, who sounded detached, almost rehearsed. The dispatcher asked the obvious questions. When was Caylee last seen? Where had she gone? Who took her? But Casey's answers lacked urgency. And investigators would later notice something unsettling about the timeline. Casey could describe social events, parties, and conversations from the previous month in detail. But when it came to explaining where her daughter had been, her memory suddenly became vague. That contradiction would become one of the first cracks in the case. But at the time, police were still focused on one thing: finding Caylee alive. And in those first hours, Casey Anthony presented herself as a worried mother trapped inside a nightmare. At least on the surface. But the deeper investigators looked into her life, the stranger everything became. To understand why this case exploded across America, it helps to understand who Casey Anthony appeared to be before Caylee disappeared. At 22 years old, Casey lived with her parents in Orlando along with her young daughter, Caylee. To outsiders, the family looked relatively normal. There were tensions inside the house, but nothing visibly extreme. Friends described Caylee as energetic, affectionate, and constantly attached to her mother. Casey often presented herself as independent and socially active. She claimed she worked at Universal Studios. She talked about co-workers, schedules, and responsibilities. People around her believed she had a stable routine. But there was a problem. Almost none of it was true. Long before investigators discovered Caylee was missing, Casey Anthony had already built a pattern of deception around herself. Small lies. Convenient lies. Invented details that made her life appear more stable than it actually was. At first glance, those lies didn't seem connected to a missing child investigation. But later, detectives would realize something important. Casey didn't lie the way most people lie under pressure. She lied comfortably. quickly, sometimes without hesitation. And that behavioral pattern would soon change the direction of the entire case. In June 2008, Caylee Anthony was last seen alive. The exact timeline would later become one of the most disputed parts of the investigation. Some family members believed they saw Caylee in the middle of June. Others remembered different dates. But one thing became clear very quickly. After a certain point, nobody outside Casey Anthony could confirm where Caylee was. And yet, life around Casey continued almost normally. That's what disturbed investigators the most. Because while Caylee was supposedly missing, Casey's behavior didn't resemble panic. It resembled avoidance. Photos later recovered from social events showed Casey smiling at clubs with friends. One image became especially controversial. A photograph of Casey partying at a nightclub during the period Caylee was missing. The timing horrified the public. But investigators focused on something more specific. Behavioral inconsistency. Parents with missing children often become consumed by urgency. Their routines collapse. Their focus narrows. But Casey appeared detached from the crisis she later claimed had been unfolding around her. And then there was the tattoo. Just days after Caylee disappeared, Casey got a tattoo reading, Bella Vita. Beautiful life. To some people, it meant nothing. To others, it became symbolic of the entire mystery. How could someone describe life as beautiful while secretly searching for a missing child? Unless she already knew something nobody else knew yet. But at this stage, investigators still lacked evidence. All they had were contradictions. And contradictions alone don't solve cases. Then detectives started verifying Casey's statements. And everything began falling apart. One of the first things investigators wanted to confirm was Casey's employment. According to Casey, she worked at Universal Studios Orlando. It sounded believable. She spoke confidently about coworkers and office locations. So detectives decided to follow her there. At first, Casey appeared calm. She walked investigators through the building as though she belonged there. Hallways. Offices. Employee areas. The performance continued for several minutes. But then something changed. Casey suddenly stopped walking. She turned to investigators and admitted the truth. She didn't work there. She never had. Detectives later described the moment as surreal. Because Casey hadn't simply exaggerated employment details. She had physically led police through a real workplace while maintaining a fabricated identity. That moment changed how investigators viewed her entirely. Now the question wasn't just where Caylee was. It was whether anything Casey said could be trusted at all. And the lies kept expanding. The nanny. Fake phone numbers. Fake coworkers. Stories that dissolved the moment detectives attempted to verify them. Each lie created another question. Not just about the disappearance. But about Casey herself. Why lie so aggressively if your child is truly missing? Why waste critical investigative time? And most importantly, was the lying meant to hide panic? Or hide guilt? As media coverage intensified, public attention turned into obsession. National networks began covering the case almost non-stop. Nancy Grace dedicated repeated broadcasts to the investigation. Photos of Caylee filled television screens across America. And public sympathy quickly transformed into outrage. Because the more details emerged, the harder it became for people to understand Casey's behavior. Friends described Casey going out socially during the 31 days Caylee was supposedly missing. She stayed with her boyfriend at times. She attended parties. She entered a nightclub contest. To many observers, the behavior felt emotionally disconnected from the situation she later described. But detectives had to separate public emotion from evidence. Because suspicious behavior is not proof of a crime. Still, something about the timeline continued bothering investigators. Especially the car. The Pontiac. The smell inside it became one of the earliest focal points of the case. Tow yard employees later reported the odor was overwhelming. Cindy Anthony repeatedly described it as smelling like a dead body. Casey claimed the smell came from garbage in the trunk. And technically, garbage had been found there. But investigators noticed something else. The explanations kept changing. And every time Casey adjusted a detail, the timeline shifted with it. That's when detectives began reconstructing Casey's movements day by day. Where had she been? Who had seen her? What could actually be verified? And slowly, a disturbing pattern emerged. Large portions of Caylee Anthony's life during those 31 days existed almost entirely through her own unverified claims. That mattered. Because once investigators lose confidence in a timeline, everything inside that timeline becomes suspicious. Then came the interviews. Hours of questioning. Detectives trying to pin Casey down on specifics. And Casey continuing to provide answers that sounded polished but unstable. She rarely appeared overwhelmed. Rarely broke emotionally. Rarely displayed sustained urgency about Caylee's safety. Instead, investigators noticed something unusual. Casey often redirected conversations away from Caylee and toward explanations about herself. Where she worked. Who she knew. Why communication had failed. On its own, that meant very little. But placed inside the larger timeline, it became another inconsistency investigators couldn't ignore. Then detectives attempted to locate the nanny Casey blamed for the disappearance. Zenaida Gonzalez. Zani. The person Casey claimed had taken Caylee. But as investigators searched deeper, they encountered problem after problem. Addresses didn't match. Phone numbers failed. Connections disappeared. Eventually, detectives began questioning whether the nanny existed at all. And if the central explanation Casey provided was fabricated. Then what had actually happened to Caylee Anthony? That question transformed the investigation. Because now police were no longer dealing only with a possible abduction. They were dealing with a mother whose entire narrative was collapsing in real time. And yet Casey continued speaking confidently. Continued improvising. Continued adding details investigators later disproved. Some detectives believed she was buying time. Others believed she had convinced herself her stories could still work. But there was another possibility investigators quietly considered. That Caylee Anthony had already emotionally separated herself from the reality of what happened. And if that were true, the case might be far darker than anyone initially imagined. Meanwhile, inside the Anthony household, tensions exploded. Cindy Anthony reportedly moved between defending Casey and confronting her. George Anthony, Casey's father and former law enforcement officer, appeared increasingly unsettled by the inconsistencies. Family interviews became emotional and contradictory. And every public statement seemed to create even more confusion. One day the family emphasized hope. The next day suspicion crept into interviews and body language. America watched every second. And beneath all of it sat one terrifying question. Where was Caylee? Weeks passed. Searches intensified across Central Florida. Volunteers distributed flyers. Law enforcement chased leads across multiple locations. But the investigation kept circling back to Caylee Anthony. Not because detectives had definitive evidence, but because her behavior remained impossible to reconcile with the timeline. Then investigators began examining Casey's digital activity. Phone records. Messages. Movements. And although many details remained incomplete at that stage, detectives noticed something important. Casey appeared highly engaged socially during the exact period she later claimed she was desperately searching for her missing daughter. Again, behavior alone proved nothing. But behavior combined with deception created a pattern investigators could not ignore. And somewhere inside that pattern, they believed the truth was hiding. The longer Casey spoke, the more investigators realized something critical. Her lies were not random. They were layered. One lie protected another. A fake job supported a fake schedule. A fake nanny supported the disappearance timeline. Fake coworkers reinforced fake routines. The structure was interconnected. And interconnected lies create a dangerous problem. Once one piece collapses, everything attached to it becomes unstable. Detectives had already exposed the employment lie. Now the nanny story was deteriorating. And once those pillars disappeared, investigators were left staring at a terrifying possibility. Maybe Casey Anthony had never been searching for Caylee at all. Maybe the 31-day delay wasn't confusion. Maybe it was concealment. But concealment of what? That question would soon define the entire investigation. Because investigators were about to uncover evidence that shifted the case from strange to potentially catastrophic. Before the summer ended, cadaver dogs would alert near Casey's vehicle. Forensic investigators would begin analyzing the trunk more aggressively. And detectives would realize they might not be searching for a kidnapped child anymore. They might be searching for a body. But perhaps the most important discovery had already happened. Not in a forest. Not in a laboratory. Inside an interrogation room. Because investigators had finally recognized the one thing that made Casey Anthony so dangerous to question. She didn't just tell lies. She built realities around them. And once police began tearing those realities apart, everything Casey Anthony had carefully constructed started collapsing with it. The moment detectives realized Casey Anthony had lied about working at Universal Studios, the entire case changed. Up until then, investigators still believed they might be dealing with a desperate young mother hiding embarrassing personal problems. But standing inside those office hallways in Orlando, watching Casey confidently guide them through a workplace she had never actually worked at, something clicked. This wasn't panic. This was performance. And if Casey Anthony could invent an entire professional life without hesitation, then investigators had to consider a far more disturbing possibility. What if the story about Caylee disappearing was fabricated too? By late July 2008, the investigation surrounding Casey Anthony had become one of the fastest-growing media stories in America. Every interview, every body language analysis, every contradiction, it all became national news. But behind the cameras and headlines, detectives inside Orlando were facing a problem far more dangerous than public outrage. They were losing time. Because every hour investigators spent chasing one of Casey's stories was another hour without answers about 2-year-old Caylee Anthony. And Casey kept giving them stories. New ones. Modified ones. Versions layered on top of earlier lies. The interrogations became psychological chess matches. Detectives tried to lock down timelines. Casey kept moving them. They pushed for names. Casey supplied names that often led nowhere. Addresses. Co-workers. Friends. Babysitters. Entire fragments of reality that dissolved the moment police attempted to verify them. At first, investigators believed Casey's lying might be defensive. People under stress lie sometimes, especially when they fear judgment. But Casey's behavior felt different. Her lies were unusually detailed. And more importantly, they were delivered calmly. That detail kept bothering detectives. Because most people improvising under pressure eventually show signs of collapse. Confusion. Emotional spikes. Contradictions caused by exhaustion. But Casey Anthony often appeared composed. Even conversational. At times, investigators later said she almost seemed more focused on controlling perception than locating her missing daughter. And then there was Zani, the nanny. The person Casey blamed for everything. According to Casey, a woman named Zenaida Gonzalez had taken Caylee and vanished. It sounded specific enough to feel believable. That was the problem. Casey rarely told vague lies. She built lies with structure. Enough detail to make investigators hesitate before dismissing them. Enough realism to consume valuable time. Detectives immediately began trying to locate the nanny. Phone records were checked. Addresses examined. Potential connections investigated. But piece by piece, the story began collapsing. The phone numbers Casey provided didn't connect properly. Addresses failed. Witnesses contradicted key details. And eventually, investigators started asking a terrifying question. Did Zani the nanny exist at all? That possibility changed the tone of every interrogation afterward. Because if the central kidnapping explanation was fabricated, then Casey Anthony wasn't just withholding information. She might be manufacturing an entire crime scenario. And the deeper investigators dug into Casey's life, the stranger everything became. It suggested Casey could maintain fabricated realities under direct pressure far longer than most people. And if she could do that during a controlled police walkthrough, what else could she maintain? Back at the sheriff's office, detectives began reviewing every previous interview differently. Not as statements from a grieving parent, but as strategic narratives. And once they adopted that perspective, new inconsistencies emerged everywhere. Casey frequently shifted focus away from Caylee herself. When detectives asked direct questions about the timeline, conversations often drifted toward explanations about work, social plans, friends, or logistical complications. On its own, none of that proved anything. But placed into the broader context of a missing child investigation, it created unease. Investigators began noticing that Casey spoke about her own inconvenience more consistently than she spoke about fear for Caylee's safety. Again, not proof. But behavior matters in investigations. Especially repeated behavior. And Casey's behavior kept forcing detectives back to the same question. Was she protecting herself from embarrassment? Or from criminal exposure? Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified. National television networks transformed the case into daily programming. Photos of Casey partying circulated constantly online and across cable news broadcasts. One image in particular kept reappearing. Casey smiling at a nightclub during the exact period she later claimed she was desperately searching for her missing daughter. To the public, the optics were devastating. But investigators remained careful. Suspicious behavior alone could not establish what happened to Caylee. Still, public pressure changed the environment around the case dramatically. Tips flooded in. Rumors spread. Speculation exploded. And detectives found themselves trapped between two competing pressures. The need to move quickly. And the need to move carefully. Because despite growing suspicion surrounding Casey Anthony, there was still no body. No confirmed crime scene. No definitive forensic proof. Only contradictions. And contradictions don't always survive in court. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The lies were beginning to intersect with physical evidence. And that's when investigators became truly concerned. And Casey's interrogations became more aggressive. Detectives pressed harder on specifics. Where exactly had Caylee been? Why wait 31 days to report her missing? Why continue lying after investigators disproved earlier claims? Casey's answers evolved constantly. At times she appeared cornered. Then moments later, composed again. It was as though she adapted emotionally in real time depending on pressure levels inside the room. That unpredictability frustrated investigators. Because they still couldn't determine whether Casey was a manipulative offender, or someone psychologically unraveling under extraordinary stress. The distinction mattered. A guilty person and a panicked innocent person can both lie. But they usually lie differently. Investigators began analyzing not only what Casey said, but how she said it. How quickly she responded. Which topics triggered emotional shifts. Which questions she avoided. Patterns emerged. Questions about herself generated long, detailed answers. Questions about Caylee often became fragmented or redirected. Again and again, detectives circled back to the same emotional inconsistency. Casey appeared highly invested in maintaining narratives about her own life, but strangely detached from the urgency surrounding her missing daughter. Then investigators uncovered another unsettling detail. Casey's social activity during the 31-day gap remained extensive. Phone calls, visits with friends, parties, romantic relationships. Normal routines continued almost uninterrupted. That timeline disturbed investigators because it contradicted Casey's later portrayal of herself as a mother privately struggling through a kidnapping crisis. Most people experiencing a genuine abduction don't preserve normal social behavior patterns for weeks. Especially not in secret. Unless they believe there is no active emergency left to solve. That possibility changed everything. And once detectives started privately considering that scenario, the case darkened considerably. Behind closed doors, investigators began discussing whether Caylee Anthony might no longer be alive. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally, the tone shifted. Search efforts expanded. Forensic analysis intensified. And detectives started reviewing Casey's statements not as possible clues to a kidnapping, but as potential concealment strategies. That shift marked the true beginning of what would become one of the most controversial investigations in modern American true crime history. Because from that point forward, every new detail carried two possible meanings. Either Caylee Anthony was an immature, dishonest young mother trapped inside escalating panic, or she was carefully constructing distance between herself and whatever happened to Caylee. And investigators still didn't know which explanation terrified them more. Then came another critical problem. The false leads. Every fabricated detail Casey introduced consumed resources. Detectives tracked people who didn't exist. Followed timelines that collapsed. Verified employment records connected to jobs Casey never held. Entire sections of the investigation effectively disappeared into dead ends. Weeks were being lost. And with every passing day, the likelihood of finding clear answers decreased. That reality created growing frustration inside law enforcement. Because deception in missing child investigations is uniquely dangerous. It doesn't just mislead investigators. It destroys timing. And timing is everything. Especially if evidence still exists somewhere. Then investigators began noticing a subtle but important behavioral pattern. Whenever detectives cornered Casey on one lie, she often replaced it with a slightly altered version instead of abandoning the larger narrative entirely. That mattered psychologically. Because it suggested Casey wasn't improvising randomly. She appeared committed to preserving a broader framework. A framework where she remained separated from direct responsibility. And if that interpretation was correct, then the lies themselves weren't the story. They were protection mechanisms. Protection from what? That remained the central question. By August 2008, the case had transformed completely. America no longer viewed it simply as a missing child investigation. It had become something darker. A story about deception. About timelines that didn't fit. About behavior that investigators could not logically reconcile. And somewhere inside that confusion, detectives believed the truth was still buried. Then forensic investigators made another discovery connected to Casey's car. Air sample analysis from the trunk appeared consistent with compounds associated with human decomposition. The science would later become heavily debated during trial proceedings. But at the time, investigators saw the findings as deeply significant. Because now the case no longer revolved only around suspicious behavior. Physical evidence was beginning to point in the same direction as the interrogations. Toward death. Toward concealment. Toward the possibility that Caylee Anthony had never been kidnapped at all. And perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators still didn't know where she was. But somewhere beyond the interviews, beyond the media circus, beyond the collapsing lies, another discovery was waiting. A discovery hidden less than a mile from the Anthony family home. One that would soon transform this investigation from a national mystery into a homicide case. Less than a mile from the Anthony family home. Hidden in a wooded area investigators had searched repeatedly. Someone was about to discover what the entire country had feared for months. By December 2008, the search for Caylee Anthony no longer felt like a rescue operation. The atmosphere around the investigation had changed. The interviews, the forensic analysis, the collapsing timeline surrounding Casey Anthony. Everything pointed investigators toward a possibility they had tried to avoid saying publicly. That Caylee Anthony was never coming home alive. And when the discovery finally happened, it transformed the case permanently. The area where the remains were found sat close to the Anthony family neighborhood in Orlando. Thick brush, wet terrain, an area easy to overlook unless someone knew exactly where to look. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker contacted authorities after spotting what appeared to be a skull near the wooded site. Investigators responded quickly. And almost immediately, they realized the scene was far more serious than anyone hoped. Scattered skeletal remains were recovered from the area. Nearby, investigators located pieces of children's clothing, a blanket, and duct tape. That detail changed everything. Because until that moment, the case still technically existed in a space between uncertainty and suspicion. Now investigators were standing at what appeared to be a disposal site. And the entire investigation shifted overnight. The missing child case became a homicide investigation. For months, the public had watched the story unfold through contradictions and media speculation. But the discovery in the woods altered the emotional gravity of the case completely. Now there were remains. Now there was a crime scene. Now there was physical evidence. And perhaps most critically, the location itself raised disturbing questions. Why were the remains found so close to the Anthony family home? Why hadn't they been discovered earlier despite previous searches in the area? And if Caylee had been there for months, who placed her there? Investigators immediately secured the site and began reconstructing every possible detail surrounding the remains. The duct tape became central almost instantly. According to prosecutors, tape had been located near the lower portion of the skull. That observation would later become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because prosecutors interpreted the tape as evidence of homicide. The defense would eventually challenge that interpretation aggressively. But in late 2008, investigators viewed it differently. Placed inside the broader timeline surrounding Casey Anthony's lies and unexplained behavior, the duct tape appeared deeply incriminating. And the public reaction was immediate. National outrage intensified overnight. Television coverage exploded across every major network. Theories multiplied. Experts debated the evidence continuously. And for many Americans following the case, one question now dominated everything else. If Caylee's remains were found so close to home, how could Casey Anthony not know? That question fueled public suspicion faster than investigators could contain it. But law enforcement still faced a major challenge. Suspicion is not proof. Even with the remains recovered, prosecutors still needed to establish exactly what happened. And more importantly, who caused it? That required reconstructing a timeline with almost no direct witnesses and limited physical evidence. So investigators turned toward forensic analysis. The Anthony family computer became a major focal point. Digital forensic investigators reviewed search history, internet activity, and deleted records. What they found would soon become one of the prosecution's most controversial arguments. Searches linked to chloroform. At first glance, the findings appeared alarming. Internet activity connected to terms involving chloroform and chemical substances seemed to appear during the period Caylee disappeared. Prosecutors viewed the searches as potentially critical. Because if someone inside the Anthony home researched chloroform before Caylee vanished, it could suggest preparation, intent, possibly even premeditation. But the issue quickly became complicated. Who conducted the searches? When exactly were they performed? And could prosecutors prove beyond doubt that Casey Anthony was responsible for them? Those questions would later become central courtroom battles. But during the investigation phase, detectives saw the searches as another piece sliding into place beside the other inconsistencies already surrounding Casey. On their own, internet searches prove very little. People search strange things online constantly. But placed beside the 31-day delay, the false nanny story, the misleading employment claims, the suspicious activity surrounding the car, and now the remains in the woods, the digital evidence appeared increasingly significant. That's when the investigation's tone became unmistakably darker. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began discussing homicide strategy. Not accidental death. Not neglect. Intentional killing. And internally, law enforcement started preparing the public for that shift. By this point, the psychological atmosphere surrounding Casey Anthony had changed dramatically. Earlier in the investigation, debate centered around whether she was immature, dishonest, or overwhelmed. Now public perception hardened into something far more severe. Polls, media panels, and public commentary increasingly assumed guilt. Casey Anthony became one of the most scrutinized women in America. And every past behavior was now being re-examined through a different lens. The nightclub photos. The Bella Vita tattoo. The smiling social appearances. The shifting explanations. All of it took on new meaning once Caylee's remains were discovered. But investigators still had to separate emotional reaction from evidentiary value. Because criminal prosecutions don't succeed on public outrage. They succeed on provable facts. And despite the discovery of the remains, major gaps still existed. No definitive cause of death could be established due to the condition of the remains. That limitation would become enormously important later. Because without a clear medical determination, prosecutors would need to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and behavioral patterns. And circumstantial cases can become dangerous inside a courtroom. Especially when the defense only needs to create reasonable doubt. Still, prosecutors believed they had enough to move forward aggressively. Then investigators revisited Casey Anthony's statements from earlier interrogations. Now, viewed against the recovery scene, many details sounded different. The invented nanny. The misleading timelines. The failure to report Caylee missing. Each lie no longer felt disconnected. Instead, prosecutors increasingly viewed them as obstruction. Attempts to delay scrutiny. Attempts to create distance between Casey and the disappearance. And perhaps most importantly, attempts to control the narrative long enough for physical evidence to disappear. That possibility terrified investigators because decomposition changes cases dramatically. Time erodes forensic clarity. Environmental exposure destroys evidence. And the longer a body remains undiscovered, the harder it becomes to establish exactly what happened. Placed against that reality, the 31-day delay suddenly looked even more significant. Because every day without police involvement benefited one person more than anyone else. The person already controlling the story. Meanwhile, media attention intensified to unprecedented levels. Satellite trucks lined streets near the Anthony family home. Legal analysts dissected every new filing. Former detectives appeared nightly on television discussing interrogation behavior and forensic possibilities. The case stopped feeling regional. It became national theater. But underneath the spectacle, prosecutors continued building something far more methodical. A murder case constructed almost entirely through layers of indirect evidence. And the challenge was enormous. Because they needed to convince a future jury not only that Caylee Anthony died, but that her death was intentional. That distinction mattered. Especially with no eyewitnesses and limited forensic certainty. So prosecutors focused on behavioral interpretation. What did Casey Anthony do after Caylee disappeared? What didn't she do? Why avoid police? Why continue social routines? Why invent Zani? Why maintain false employment stories? Why allow 31 days to pass? Individually, each answer remained incomplete. Together, prosecutors believed the pattern formed something stronger. Consciousness of guilt. But the defense would eventually see the same evidence very differently. And that conflict was already beginning to form quietly in the background. Because there remained another possibility investigators could not fully eliminate. What if Caylee's death was accidental? What if the lies afterward reflected panic rather than murder? That uncertainty lingered over the investigation constantly, even among professionals deeply suspicious of Casey Anthony. And that uncertainty would later become one of the most important dynamics in the entire trial. But before any courtroom battle could begin, prosecutors had another decision to make. How aggressively should they pursue the case? The answer arrived in October 2008 before the remains were formally identified, but after investigators increasingly believed Caylee was dead. A grand jury indicted Casey Anthony on first-degree murder charges. By December, after the remains were identified as Caylee's, the prosecution's direction became unmistakable. This was no longer being treated as an unexplained disappearance. The state believed it was dealing with intentional homicide. And prosecutors intended to pursue the highest possible consequences. That announcement sent shockwaves through the country. Because it elevated the stakes of the case instantly. Death penalty cases operate differently. They require heightened legal scrutiny, higher evidentiary expectations, more strategic prosecution planning. And for the public, the announcement signaled something else. Authorities believed the evidence pointed not simply toward responsibility, but toward deliberate murder. Inside the Anthony household, pressure intensified dramatically. Family relationships fractured further under scrutiny. Public hostility escalated. And Casey Anthony herself became increasingly isolated inside the national conversation. To many observers, the case already appeared solved emotionally. But prosecutors understood a dangerous reality. Public belief and courtroom proof are not the same thing. And the closer they examined the evidence, the more they realized how heavily the future trial might depend on interpretation rather than certainty. Because the forensic picture remained incomplete. The timeline still contained gaps. And the defense would eventually challenge nearly every major conclusion investigators intended to present. Still, by the end of 2008, the direction of the case was clear. The woods near the Anthony home had transformed everything. The remains, the duct tape, the computer searches, the behavior after Caylee disappeared. Prosecutors believed the pieces formed a coherent narrative. A narrative of homicide followed by concealment. But building a theory is one thing. Proving it beyond reasonable doubt in front of 12 jurors is another entirely. And soon, one of the most watched courtroom battles in modern American history would begin. A battle where every lie, every forensic detail, every emotional reaction, and every unanswered question would be dissected publicly. Because prosecutors were preparing to seek the ultimate punishment. And the defense was preparing to tear the entire case apart. When prosecutors announced they were prepared to seek the death penalty against Casey Anthony, the investigation stopped being just a criminal case. It became a national obsession. By the time the trial officially began in Orlando, millions of Americans already believed they knew exactly what happened to 2-year-old Caylee Anthony. That assumption created a dangerous environment inside the courtroom. Because prosecutors weren't entering trial with a confession. They weren't entering with eyewitnesses. And they weren't entering with a definitive cause of death. Instead, they were about to build one of the most aggressive circumstantial murder cases in modern American history. And the defense intended to dismantle it piece by piece. By May 2011, media trucks surrounded the courthouse daily. Cable news networks broadcast courtroom updates from morning until night. Legal analysts debated jury strategy in real time. Every expression inside the courtroom became national content. The case no longer belonged only to investigators or attorneys. It belonged to the public. And public opinion had already hardened. Years of media coverage had created a powerful narrative around Casey Anthony long before opening statements began. For many Americans, the emotional verdict already existed. But criminal trials do not operate on emotional certainty. They operate on provable facts. And that distinction would soon dominate the entire proceeding. The prosecution's theory was direct. Casey Anthony intentionally killed her daughter and attempted to conceal the crime. According to prosecutors, the lies after Caylee disappeared weren't random acts of panic. They were calculated distractions. The false kidnapping story. The delay in reporting Caylee missing. The misleading statements to investigators. The behavior afterward. Prosecutors argued these actions reflected consciousness of guilt. But they needed something stronger than suspicious conduct. They needed jurors to believe Casey caused Caylee's death deliberately. That's where the forensic evidence became central. Prosecutors introduced testimony about duct tape recovered near Caylee's remains. They emphasized decomposition evidence connected to Casey's vehicle. And they focused heavily on computer searches associated with chloroform. Their theory suggested preparation and intentional harm. At times, prosecutors presented the case almost like a puzzle. Each individual piece appeared incomplete on its own. But together, they argued, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Yet the defense approached the exact same evidence from a completely different direction. And that collision between interpretations became the defining tension of the trial. Because the defense did not merely deny murder. They introduced an entirely different explanation for Caylee's death. An accidental drowning inside the Anthony family swimming pool. That theory stunned many observers. According to defense attorney Jose Baez, Caylee accidentally drowned in June 2008. The defense argued the family panicked afterward. And rather than report the accident immediately, the situation spiraled into concealment and deception. But the defense strategy went further than most people expected. Far further. Because during opening statements, Jose Baez made explosive allegations involving Casey's father, George Anthony. The defense suggested George helped cover up Caylee's death. And they implied deeply disturbing dysfunction inside the Anthony family home. The courtroom reaction was immediate. The prosecution objected repeatedly. Observers watched George Anthony closely as the accusations unfolded. And suddenly, the trial stopped revolving around only one central question. It became a battle between two radically different versions of reality. One side argued Casey Anthony was a calculating mother who murdered her child. The other argued the death was accidental and the family itself became trapped inside fear, denial, and deception. The jury now faced a problem that would define the entire case. Which version of events explained the evidence more convincingly? Because neither side possessed a complete forensic picture. That limitation shaped every major courtroom moment. Unlike many homicide cases, prosecutors could not show jurors a clear medical cause of death. The condition of Caylee's remains prevented certainty. That gap became one of the defense's strongest weapons. Again and again, defense attorneys emphasized the same point. No one could medically prove how Caylee died. Not definitively. And inside a murder trial, uncertainty matters enormously. Especially in a death penalty case. Prosecutors responded by focusing on behavior and sequence. They argued Casey Anthony's actions after Caylee disappeared revealed intent. Why invent a kidnapping? Why avoid police? Why continue normal social activities? Why create false explanations repeatedly? According to prosecutors, innocent panic could not reasonably explain the full pattern. But the defense reframed those same actions differently. They portrayed Casey as emotionally damaged, conflict avoidant, and shaped by a dysfunctional household environment. Not a murderer. Just someone psychologically unequipped to handle trauma and consequences. And for jurors, the distinction became increasingly complicated. As testimony continued, the trial evolved into something far larger than a forensic debate. It became psychological warfare. Every witness mattered. Every contradiction mattered. Every emotional reaction inside the courtroom mattered. Then came the forensic testimony. Experts discussed air sample analysis from Casey's car trunk. Chemical compounds. Decomposition science. Duct tape placement. The prosecution presented these findings as interconnected indicators of homicide. But defense attorneys attacked the certainty of nearly every conclusion. Cross-examinations became highly technical. Could decomposition evidence inside the car be explained another way? Was the duct tape actually applied before decomposition? Could environmental exposure have altered the scene? The defense repeatedly introduced doubt into areas prosecutors hoped jurors would view as decisive. And sometimes the strategy appeared effective. Because circumstantial cases rely heavily on interpretation. And interpretation becomes fragile when experts disagree publicly. Meanwhile, George Anthony became one of the most emotionally complex figures in the trial. His testimony carried enormous weight. Not only because he was Casey's father, but because both sides used him differently. The prosecution often framed George as a grieving grandfather trapped inside an unimaginable situation. The defense suggested something far more complicated. Under cross-examination, George faced intense scrutiny over timelines, statements, and family dynamics. At times he appeared devastated. At other moments, defensive. Observers inside the courtroom analyzed his reactions constantly. And jurors watched everything. Because beneath the legal arguments, the Anthony family itself appeared fractured in ways difficult to fully understand from the outside. That emotional instability complicated the trial further. Then the defense introduced another critical point. If Casey Anthony truly planned an intentional murder, where was the direct evidence of planning? No fingerprints on the duct tape. No eyewitnesses. No confession. No definitive forensic mechanism establishing homicide. The prosecution insisted the circumstantial evidence collectively answered those questions. But the defense kept returning to the same concept. Reasonable doubt. Not certainty of innocence. Only uncertainty of guilt. That standard would become enormously important later. Outside the courthouse, public opinion remained intense. Many Americans struggled to reconcile the defense theory with Casey's earlier behavior. The lies. The partying. The delayed reporting. To much of the public, those actions already felt morally damning. But courtroom strategy operates differently than public morality. Defense teams do not need to prove likability. They need to fracture certainty. And slowly, some legal analysts began noticing cracks forming inside the prosecution narrative. Particularly surrounding causation. Because while prosecutors strongly implied intentional homicide, the inability to medically establish how Caylee died created a vulnerability the defense exploited relentlessly. Still, prosecutors pressed forward aggressively. Witnesses described Casey's conduct after Caylee disappeared. Investigators outlined the deceptive timeline. Experts interpreted forensic findings in support of homicide. The state attempted to show jurors not simply isolated suspicious actions, but a continuous pattern pointing toward deliberate concealment after murder. Then came one of the trial's most important strategic questions. Why would Casey Anthony lie so extensively if Caylee's death were truly accidental? The defense answer was psychological. Fear. Family dysfunction. Emotional immaturity. An inability to confront consequences. The prosecution answer was criminal. Because the lies protected the truth. And somewhere between those two explanations sat the central uncertainty of the case. One jurors would eventually have to resolve. As weeks passed, testimony became emotionally exhausting. Photos of Caylee filled courtroom screens repeatedly. Audio recordings resurfaced. Family interviews were replayed. Jurors listened to technical forensic language one moment and deeply personal family conflict the next. The emotional rhythm of the trial became disorienting. At times prosecutors appeared dominant. Then defense cross-examinations reopened uncertainty almost immediately. That fluctuation created enormous tension inside legal analysis surrounding the case. Because despite overwhelming public attention, predicting the verdict became increasingly difficult. Then the trial entered its final stage. Closing arguments. The prosecution urged jurors to view the evidence collectively. Not as disconnected coincidences, but as one unified narrative leading directly back to Casey Anthony. The defense urged jurors to focus on absence. Absence of certainty. Absence of direct proof. Absence of a medically confirmed homicide mechanism. And inside criminal law, absence can become powerful. Especially when a person's life is at stake. Finally, after weeks of testimony and years of national attention, the case moved into deliberation. The courtroom atmosphere changed completely. The cameras outside. The endless speculation. The emotional testimony. Now everything narrowed down to 12 jurors inside a single room. And almost nobody felt confident about what would happen next. Because beneath all the headlines and assumptions, the jury faced an extraordinarily difficult task. Not deciding whether Casey Anthony behaved suspiciously. Not deciding whether she lied. But deciding whether the prosecution had eliminated every reasonable doubt surrounding murder. Across America, people waited. Some expecting conviction. Others warning the prosecution's case contained more uncertainty than the public realized. And as the jury prepared to announce its verdict, one question quietly hung over the entire country. Had prosecutors actually proven what happened to Caylee Anthony? Or had they only proven that Casey Anthony lied? The moment the jury left the courtroom, the entire United States held its breath. Inside the trial of Casey Anthony, nothing more could be said, argued, or corrected. Everything now depended on 12 people in a closed room. For years, the world had followed every detail surrounding the disappearance of Caylee Anthony in Orlando. The lies. The interrogation recordings. The forensic interpretations. The trial testimony that divided experts across the country. And now all of it collapsed into one question. Had the prosecution proven murder beyond a reasonable doubt? When the verdict was finally read in July 2011, the courtroom did not erupt. It froze. Casey Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of aggravated manslaughter. Not guilty of aggravated child abuse. But she was found guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement. For a moment, the words did not seem to register publicly. Because after years of coverage, speculation, and emotional buildup, the outcome did not match what many people expected. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. Confusion. Anger. Disbelief. And in some cases, outright outrage. Across the country, news stations replayed the verdict repeatedly, trying to process what had just happened. Because to many viewers, the case had already felt resolved long before the jury spoke. But inside the legal system, something very different had occurred. The jury had not decided whether Casey Anthony was innocent in a moral sense. They had decided whether the prosecution proved its case to the highest legal standard required in criminal law. And that standard is not emotion. It is certainty beyond reasonable doubt. In the hours after the verdict, legal analysts began breaking down the trial piece by piece. Former detectives reviewed interrogation footage. Forensic experts re-examined evidence presented in court. And one theme began appearing repeatedly across professional commentary. The case was built heavily on circumstantial evidence. No direct eyewitness testimony linking Casey Anthony to a homicide. No definitive forensic conclusion establishing cause of death. No confirmed confession. Instead, prosecutors had presented a pattern. A pattern of lies. A pattern of behavioral inconsistencies. A pattern of suspicious timing and missing explanations. But patterns, while persuasive, do not always meet the legal threshold required for conviction. That distinction became the center of national debate. Some former investigators argued the interrogation phase contained critical missed opportunities. They suggested investigators spent too much time verifying fabricated leads instead of narrowing pressure early on. Others argued the opposite. That Casey Anthony's behavior during questioning revealed deliberate manipulation designed to mislead investigators from the beginning. But even among professionals, agreement was rare. Because interrogation behavior can be interpreted multiple ways depending on context. And context in this case was constantly incomplete. One of the most debated elements remained the early investigation phase. Detectives had been forced to chase multiple false narratives simultaneously. The nanny story. The employment claims. The shifting timelines. Each required verification. Each consumed time. And each turned out to be false. Some analysts later argued that this fragmentation slowed the investigation at a critical stage. Others countered that investigators had no choice but to follow every lead in a missing child case. Because ignoring potential leads can be just as dangerous as pursuing false ones. The result was a case defined not only by what investigators found, but by what they had to spend time disproving. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence continued to divide interpretation. The air analysis from Casey Anthony's vehicle, the decomposition-related indicators, the duct tape recovered near the remains of Caylee. Each piece had been presented in court as part of a larger narrative. But none of it provided absolute scientific certainty about cause of death. And in a criminal trial, uncertainty can determine the outcome. After the verdict, prosecutors defended their case publicly. They argued the jury had misunderstood the cumulative strength of the evidence. That each individual piece, when viewed together, formed a cohesive narrative of guilt. But defense supporters and legal analysts pointed to the same gap. The absence of a medically definitive cause of death. That gap would become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. Because without it, jurors were left to weigh behavior against proof. And behavior alone, no matter how suspicious, does not always meet legal standards for conviction. Outside the courtroom, the emotional reaction was far more intense than the legal analysis. The public struggled to reconcile two competing realities. On one side, a mother who lied repeatedly during a missing child investigation. On the other, a legal system that had acquitted her of murder. That contradiction fueled national frustration. Social media reactions surged. Television commentary intensified. Public debates erupted across the country. Many people expressed disbelief that someone they viewed as clearly responsible had been acquitted. But others emphasized a different principle. The justice system is designed to prevent conviction without proof beyond reasonable doubt. Not to reflect public certainty. In the days following the verdict, Casey Anthony became one of the most controversial figures in modern American legal history. But the story did not end with the trial. It expanded into a broader examination of how criminal investigations are interpreted by the public. The interrogation phase, once seen as a path toward answers, was now being re-evaluated as a complex psychological exchange where certainty was never fully achieved. At the same time, the role of media coverage came under scrutiny. For 3 years, the case had been broadcast continuously across national networks. Every update shaped public perception. Every leaked detail influenced opinion. Every televised analysis reinforced narrative expectations. By the time the jury was selected, many Americans already held strong beliefs about the outcome. That created a separate tension. The difference between public conviction and legal conviction. After the verdict, experts debated whether such intense media saturation affects how cases are perceived and whether it creates unrealistic expectations about courtroom outcomes. Because when a case becomes a national story, the legal process often competes with public storytelling. And those two systems do not always align. Another major theme that emerged in post-verdict analysis was the structure of circumstantial cases. Prosecutors had relied heavily on interconnected evidence. Behavioral patterns. Forensic interpretations. Digital activity. Timeline inconsistencies. Each piece reinforced the other. But critics argued that without a definitive anchor point, such cases remain vulnerable to alternative explanations. And the defense had successfully introduced one. Accidental death. Whether accepted or rejected, the existence of that alternative theory was enough to create reasonable doubt under the law. That principle became the defining legal takeaway of the case. Then came the long-term impact. The Casey Anthony trial became a reference point in legal education, investigative training, and media ethics discussions. It raised questions about how missing child cases are investigated, how interrogation strategies are applied, how forensic evidence is interpreted under uncertainty, and how public opinion forms long before a verdict is reached. Over time, the case also became symbolic of a deeper divide. Suspicion versus proof. What people believe versus what can be legally established. Those two forces rarely align perfectly. And in this case, they diverged dramatically. Years later, the case still remained one of the most discussed criminal trials in American history. Not because every question was answered, but because many were not. And that absence of closure became part of its lasting identity. For some, the verdict represented a failure of justice. For others, it represented the system functioning exactly as intended under strict legal standards. Both interpretations continue to exist simultaneously. And neither has fully replaced the other. But one question continues to return whenever the case is revisited. Was the outcome determined by lack of evidence? Or by the complexity of interpreting evidence that could never tell a single clear story? Because in the end, the trial did not only test one defendant. It tested how far certainty can be stretched inside a courtroom. Before doubt becomes stronger than belief.